So here we go. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks. I always said, if I brought Coplex into this world, I would be the one to take it out. So hey everyone, I'm Sara Ford, and many of you remember me from obviously Coplex, and also Visual Studio when I used to do the Tip of the Day series and speak a lot about Visual Studio, open source. I used to travel internationally and give tons of talks. And maybe some of you happen to remember this from about 7 or 8 years ago. I jumped off the tallest building in the Southern Hemisphere, the Sky Tower in New Zealand, to promote Coplex, because you never know how you're going to have to fight for open source. But that said, but actually what almost no one knows is shortly after I moved to California in 2011, I moved down there for sunlight and also to train with my grandmaster. I was very close to a third-degree black belt in karate. And also, I started doing triathlons. And shortly after I moved down there, I actually got seriously injured. I was given a compression sock that was too tight, and so it ended up doing nerve damage, severe nerve damage to the nerves in the skin of my leg. And it got so bad that at one point, I could barely stand, could barely walk, and I couldn't even do one rotation on a bicycle. No, not even like one rotation. And people would ask me, was it karate? And I go, no, it wasn't karate. It was a sock. I'm like, who gets hurt from a sock? So anyways, I had to do PT 3 times a week for the first year, twice a week for the second year, once a week for the third year, so on and so forth, until I was able to actually get back to training with the Grandmaster, be able to do the third-degree black belt techniques. And my leg doctor, who's an anesthesiologist for neurosurgery at Stanford, actually drove the 2 hours of traffic to come out and watch me do karate one night to show his support. And it was hands down the nicest thing anyone has ever done for me. And I made him a promise that night in front of the Grandmaster. I said, one day I would get back on stage. I don't care what it would take. I don't care how many years it would take me. But one day I'm going to get back to the things that I love to do. And I am very, very, very happy to say that today, staying on stage in front of you all is that day. So thank you. So what does a personality type like mine do when she has downtime, aka physical therapy for several years? They go and get a master's degree in user experience because I wanted to make dev tools usable. And so there I was for 3.5 years studying psychology and statistics and kinesiology courses. And I ended up working with a kinesiology professor, the study of motor learning, how, if I've never seen a particular water bottle shape before, how do I have the skill to pick it up if I've never seen it before? And they had these experiments from the 1960s, like these boxes with a light, and you would use a stylus to chase the ball around this light. I'm like, I'm not using that for the experiments. I want to build a Connect app. And then we can use the ball and follow it around the circle, and you could get all this telemetry on the human body. And I spent a year working on this app. And the researcher who was going to use my research project for her experiments, she was immediately struggling with the usability of it. And I'm like, wait, time out. I just spent 3.5 years studying usability, and I just completely missed the mark on making this project usable. Like I was really freaked out for a second, and then it clicked. And that's what you're going to hear today is this light bulb moment that I want to share with you all. There are 2 traditional ways of designing the product. There's the obvious top-down, where the PM goes off, gets the requirements, and the code is built based on those specifications. For example, I need a thingy to open up a can of soup. So like the traditional, it does one thing and does that one thing very, very well. Whereas there's also the bottom-up approach in software where we say, what's technologically possible? And let's go and enable all the things. For example, a Swiss Army knife. So you make a blade, you have the blade, and for the can opener, but then you think, what are all the other things we can do with that blade? And you put it, so it becomes a multi-purpose, but it doesn't really quite open that can of soup very well, especially when you're too sick to go run around the backyard playing MacGyver. What can I say? I love MacGyver. I almost had a picture of him at one point, but I thought that might be a little bit too much. But going back to my Connect app, thank you data binding, I was able to enable so many experiments for them. So instead of doing the one thing, the one research experiment very, very well, I gave them over 50 different experiments that they could customize. And you might hear this being mentioned as quantity versus quality, but for the context of this talk, let's think about it in terms of prescriptive, which is, I'm going to tell you one thing, and this is the way you do it, and you can only do it this way, versus descriptive. Here's in general how you do it, but you're kind of on your own to figure out how to go about what you want to build. A perfect example of prescriptive is IKEA. You get one way to build a bookcase. But if you go to the Home Depot, you're going to get descriptive guidance of, sure, you can go and get lumber, and you can go and buy a circular saw. SAW is sometimes my accent. It's a little hard to say. So you can get descriptive guidance on how to use the circular saw, but you have to know how you're going to put together these materials to build your bookshelf or bookcase. And it's a similar thing in developer tools. We can either be very, very prescriptive. One idea that comes to mind is like a starter kit. And if you have another idea, let me know afterwards, and I'll include it in this talk. Versus descriptive, sure, here's some APIs, but you're on your own to roll your own and go off the beaten path. We'll let you do it, but the documentation's not going to be as clear, or you just really kind of need to know how to do it. This is your take-home message. If you leave with nothing else today, this is what I want you to leave with. Just because something's complex does not mean it cannot be usable. So, for example, let's think about cockpit management systems. Let's think about all the apps that we can use nowadays on our phone that fit within the window in the size of a 3x5 index card. Or let's consider anesthesiology for neurosurgery. Like, I want to know nothing of that world, absolutely nothing. But I do know one thing. I want those tools to be as usable as possible for those doctors. So this was something that our grad advisor just really, really stressed to us. And including stressing this to us, she also stressed the importance of being concise. Complexity does not imply intelligence. It's actually the opposite. Simplicity implies intelligence. This is why it's so hard for us to delete code or delete features. We want to show, look, this is how hard I worked to build this feature. And I will be the first to admit, I will comment out my code before I will delete it, even if it's stored in Git. I just want to show, look, this is how hard I worked. But simplicity will imply intelligence. We just have to allow ourselves to believe it. And if you're still not quite sure, can this apply to DevTools? This is a recent research paper I read just not too long ago. And yes, I read research papers on IDE usability during my vacation. And what they did, they wanted to explore some of the challenges of using IDEs. And for this particular case, what they did was they looked at adding a new method, and they looked at renaming a method. And they applied industry standard user experience principles in conducting their usability study. And they looked at Visual Studio 2012, and they looked at Eclipse. And for the nature of this talk, I'm just going to focus in the time limit to focus on Visual Studio 2012. And here you can see that in this scenario, they added a method to the iTool interface. And they had several usability improvement suggestions, but for the nature of this talk, I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. The first one is the squiggly. It should actually be under iTool. The second one is the lack of transparency. For me as the end user, I'm like, I already implemented iTool. What do you mean? Like, implement it again. I don't understand. And transparency is going to be really fascinating as we start getting into the age of self-driving cars, because it's a black box. We kind of want to know what's going on inside there. What are you thinking about? Are you really paying attention? And then the third thing that they suggested is like the C# compiler here kind of knows what's going on. Why can't it give me a helpful hand to say, hey, if you did it this way, your code would compile? And in Visual Studio 2017, they happen to address these three suggestions. First of all, you see that the squiggly is now under ITOL. Second, for transparency, it calls out, hey, you need to go and do something, no pun intended. And then third, it tells you, hey, here's some suggestions how you might want to fix this. So it gives you kind of like a fighting chance. So dev tools can be made usable. Well, why are we so far behind? Another paper, and these folks, these are 30 UX researchers who happen to focus on IDEs. They got together for a 2.5-day seminar to talk shop, kind of like what we're doing here. And they were talking about, well, what is it? Why is it DevTools are behind? And they said, the industry standard UX principles often don't consider the culture and context of software engineering. And you'll hear context mentioned in a second. And this other paper, they did what's called a qualitative research study, as opposed to a quantitative where you say, I have this idea, you go and you run the experiment, you get a bunch of data back, you run your statistics, you get a p-value, and you check for significance. That's quantitative. What they did was a qualitative, and it was more of like exploratory, where you ask open-ended questions like in a survey. And they asked 2 questions. What are the best qualities of an IDE, and how could your IDE better support your work development? And one of the things that they mused about in the paper was UX studies focus on the end user task. So it's kind of unclear, how do these UX industry standard principles really apply to the context of software engineering? Or in other words, when you have that bottom-up approach, do UX principles still apply? And this is not like a yes and no thing. They're just happening to muse about it. So there I was, sitting in the lab, watching the grad researcher try to use my master's project, and just kind of struggling with the usability of it. I'm like, how did I get this so wrong? I have been laser focused on making this app as usable as possible for a year. What if I wasn't working on the end user experience of making this usable? What on earth was I laser focused on for this entire year? And that's when it hit me. I was in a different context. We are in a different context when we're building developer tools, especially or any tool that's from a bottom-up perspective. And that brings me to my light bulb moment, which I'll share with you as Sara Ford's theory of developer tool on usability. We design for our own testing scenarios. I believe we think that this is the ideal way for the end user to use it, but what happens, it becomes the ideal way for us to test it. Because I'm sitting there for the past year, I'm sitting there working coding, and I don't want to get up out of my seat and do wax on, wax off, every single time I want to test. No, I want to minimize the amount of keyboard shortcuts, the keystrokes I have to use, the amount of mouse clicks, and that was what I was slowly iterating on over the past year, working on that project. And now that's my claim, but I'm going to back it up with a little bit of psychology 101. Sensation is an engineering process. It is objective. For example, in my abstract, I mentioned the moon illusion. So I look out on the horizon, I see the moon coming up. The wavelengths bounce and hit my eye, and then the chemical process is kicked off that sends those chemicals to my brain, and that is an objective engineering process. Now, perception is an active mental process of interpreting those sensory information, and that's why I perceive the moon to be bigger on the horizon. This is the one that blew my mind. It was just shut it down, turn it off, let's all go home. Color doesn't exist. It is a wavelength. It is an engineering process. Or here's a different way to explain it, to really make it click. There is no way for us to compare our subjective experiences. For example, because this cup, let's just call it like this drop is blue, my blue could actually be your green. We have no way to know. We know the label is blue. We agree on the label because it's a wavelength. But we have no idea if what I see as blue is what you might actually see as green. And so then it's like, well, if color doesn't exist, but there's got to be something there. There's got to be something there. What color is it? It must be a color, but so what color is it really? And then it's like, well, if the color of this thing doesn't exist, does this thing actually exist? Does this bottle exist? Do I exist? And that unhandled exception just goes all the way up the stack. So if you're interested in HCI UX, this is the book to get. Designing with the Mind in Mind is really short read, like just slightly over 200 pages, airplane trip, and it's like 3.5 years of grad school all in one reading with all the research papers and statistics and everything else. And on the very first page, they talk about what is perceived is based on our own experience. And I'm going to prove this to you in a group exercise. Straight from the book. All right. Imagine you own a large insurance company. You are meeting with a real estate manager, discussing plans for a new campus of company buildings. The campus consists of a row of 5 buildings, the last 2 with T-shaped courtyards providing light for a cafeteria and fitness center. Now the real estate manager shows you the map. All right, who sees it? Okay, a couple hands. When you start to see it, raise your hand. All right, anyone else? Are other people seeing it? Am I at 50% yet? Okay, if you see it, raise your hand. I want to see how many people are still working on it. All right, are we still working on it? Do we see it yet? You know, and you know there's something there, and you're working on it. All right, for the rest of you, now does everyone see it? And I've given this talk several times, and those who weren't following the instructions, if they were looking down on their phone, when they look up, they see the word life immediately, and they're kind of looking around like, what did I miss? But this is exactly it. This is my absolute favorite quote. Perception is based on our prior experience, and that drives us crazy as software engineers because we expect people to see what is in front of them. It's like, yeah, I gave you a building map and you're seeing the word life? So there I was in the lab, thinking like, okay, if context is everything, then why am I, proposing that it's a testing scenario and not some other scenario? Like I said, it's all about context. But why testing? And again, just one more psychology 101 for you all. Okay, there's 2 types of knowledge. There is explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is a knowledge that we can articulate, whereas implicit is a knowledge that we can't. And for this example, I'm going to need a volunteer in the audience, maybe someone on the front row. Oh, perfect. Thank you, kind sir, for volunteering. All right, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. They're going to be really simple, kind of yes or no questions. But here's the catch. You have to keep your hands on your lap at all times. Yeah. So the idea is basically, if you want to follow along at home, you have to answer the question in your head, but don't move your hands. All right. First question, and you have to answer immediately. First question. Did you ride a bicycle here today, yes or no? No. Okay, he immediately said no. Second question. When you tie your shoestrings in the morning, do you tie them right over left or left over right?
I have no idea.
Okay, you said immediately, I have no idea. But you know how to tie your shoestrings?
Yeah.
Yes. So this is what I mean by knowledge that you can't articulate, but you know it. I believe that testing, we have such a strong desire to test our code that it is implicit knowledge. I mean, think about it. We do TDD. We think about writing the test before we even write the actual code. Testing is a matter of habit, and this is a researcher who focuses a lot on habit, and they will describe it as a repetitive behavior triggered by contextual cues in the environment that do not require conscious planning. So let's break that down. What do we mean by triggered by contextual cues in the environment? For example, you hear a phone beep. You know it's not your phone, but the next thing you know, you're checking Twitter. Were you consciously making that decision to check Twitter? No, it's just a habit. You're triggered by a cue in the environment, aka the beep, and next thing you know, you're pulling out your phone. So habits can be good things, like being able to tie your shoes in the morning, but they could also be unwanted things, like not throwing your socks in the laundry bin at night when you go to bed. And everyday actions are habitual actions, are habit actions, habitual actions. And they have to be. The fact that I am able to walk and still talk to you is an example. I'm not consciously planning, okay, how am I going to take a step? I'm actually thinking about what I'm going to say. So by having a habitual action take over, it frees up cognitive resources for you to plan your next action. And just very, very quickly, if you want to break a habit, because the trigger is actually also a part of the implicit knowledge, you actually might not know what that habit actually is, or the trigger actually is. For example, if you want to break a habit, you actually have to change the environment. The best time to change your environment is when you're like getting a new job, you're moving, because everything's going to be a new environment for you. And it's different from temptation, which is goal-based. And this is why New Year's resolutions don't work out. It's not a matter of effort. It's just that you don't know what the actual trigger is. All right, and I did say I was going to say a lot of these things, talk about this in terms of cognition, so let's get to the cognitive part. All right, so I drew that. I consider myself an abstract artist. And, okay, so the basal ganglia is what controls habitual action, and it's a part of the older part of the brain, kind of like where the brainstem is, also known as like the reptile brain or the lizard brain. So basal ganglia controls habitual actions, whereas prefrontal cortex, the newer part of the brain, so like kind of like in the front here, is the thing that is you want to free up cognitive resources to figure out, okay, what do I need to say next? Conscious thoughts and actions. All right. So I'm sitting here in the lab and I'm thinking, okay, does this work for the end user? But I don't think that's what's happening when we write code. Remember, testing is a very strong habit. So I'm thinking that the basal ganglia is taking over, that, hey, I got to verify it. And remember, we can't articulate implicit knowledge, like tying your shoes. It's an unconscious knowledge that we have. So what I think is happening right now in this state, as soon as it verifies, we're really designing for our own testing purposes. We're just not aware of it. Now, that is my hypothesis, whatever the right term is for someone who just took a couple of courses in psychology and the master's degree in human factors. But I'm kind of curious where if that might be what's happening. And so you know what you need to do. The difference now is you know why you need to do this. For example, designing with the mind on mind, great overview of UX principles. And you've always heard about seeking diverse opinions and feedback. Again, if your green could be my red, it's all for grabs, it's all fair game. And so the take-home part of this is next time you get an unusual question from an open source community member, that is your opportunity to break your implicit biases, because you can ask that person, what is it about your past experiences that have led you to this point to ask that question, that unusual question? In other words, the answer is never a label. And when you feel that label coming on, I challenge you to turn your UI upside down. No, hear me out. Don't dismiss it quite yet. Here's why. There's top-down versus bottom-up processing. So bottom-up processing is when you're kind of like learning how to read. And for the first time, it's like pickup sticks. You're trying to put the pickup sticks together, so you're having to analyze every single thing and then figure out what is that word. But then over time, your top-down processing kicks in, kind of like a shortcut or whatever. And you know this is the word the, because you've seen it 100 billion times. But I actually have to struggle not to say it the letter the. And if you've ever seen those quizzes that say, oh, find the number of H's in a sentence or whatever, this is what they're doing. They're actually betting on your top-down processes to make you not see the H in the word, even though it's clearly there. And if you want to learn how to draw something, this book recommends turning the image upside down so you'll actually draw what's there. Now, is this a good idea? Probably not, but I promise you one thing. You're not going to be reading the label. And I know I've talked a lot about Visual Studio, and because I used to be in the team, and I used to work on it from the inside for such a long time. I knew everything inside and out, but now it's like I look at things and I'm like, I just call them thingies because I just don't know what they are. And so it kind of reminds me of a song that I'd like to share with you. Hello from the outside. I must have hit F5 1,000 times to tell you I'm sorry for breaking the build, but it don't matter. Clearly, I don't write production code anymore. Alrighty, so last slide. Remember my take-home message, this is my challenge to you. Just because something's complex doesn't mean it can't be usable. So the next time you hear someone say, oh, DevTools, they're too complex to be usable, you remember cockpit management systems. You remember about medical devices and how we want them to definitely be usable. You think about all the apps that fit inside of an index card that are usable. If we can make all that usable, we can make our DevTools usable. And my challenge to myself is to keep going. You know, I've still got quite a ways to go with my recovery, but I'm getting there. I'm getting back to things. And even though everything's not perfect, I hate wearing shorts, but hey, it's weird not to be able to hide behind the comfort of your favorite clothing. But I'm going to keep doing it, keep putting myself out there. And because the next time I thank my doctor, I'm going to do it when I return to stage as an international public speaker. So thank you.